You need to step away from the first-class boarding lane right now." The sentence cracked through the quiet terminal with enough force to make nearby travelers turn their heads before they even understood what was happening. Gate B22 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport had been calm just seconds earlier, filled with the ordinary rhythm of rolling carry-on bags, boarding announcements, and the soft hum of early morning conversations. At exactly 6:45 a.m., that rhythm broke. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the handle of a modest black suitcase, the other holding a boarding pass that had already been scanned once without issue. She wore dark jeans, white sneakers, and a charcoal sweater beneath a lightweight jacket. No luxury handbag. No designer logo. No jewelry beyond a simple silver watch. She looked like someone catching a business flight after a long week, and for certain people standing nearby, that appearance was all the evidence they believed they needed. "First-class passengers are already boarding," the security officer continued, extending his arm toward the general waiting area. "This line isn't for everyone." Naomi slowly lowered her eyes to the boarding pass in her hand, then back to the officer. Her voice remained even, almost gentle. "Would you mind scanning it one more time?" A faint laugh escaped from the gate supervisor standing a few feet away. "The scanner isn't the problem, Several passengers glanced at one another. A middle-aged couple whispered. A college student quietly removed one earbud. A businessman looked up from his laptop. The atmosphere shifted in the subtle way it always does when strangers sense they are about to witness something uncomfortable. Naomi did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood where she was, composed enough to make everyone else seem unusually restless. The officer frowned, mistaking calm for hesitation. "I'm asking you nicely," he said. "Please step aside before we delay boarding." Naomi nodded once, almost thoughtfully, as though she were studying every word instead of resisting it. She looked briefly toward the aircraft visible through the terminal windows, then back at the employees surrounding her. Every expression, every tone, every assumption. She noticed them all. None of the staff realized they were being observed just as carefully as they believed they were judging her. Nearby, a woman wearing an expensive cream-colored coat approached the boarding lane with a first-class ticket in one hand and a coffee in the other. She was waved through without a single question. No second scan. No request for identification. No hesitation. Naomi watched quietly. So did a young flight attendant named Emily Carter, who had been reviewing the premium passenger manifest moments earlier. Something about the name on that list suddenly echoed in her memory, but before she could speak, the gate supervisor dismissed her with a quick glance and turned back toward Naomi. "We're not doing this all morning," he said. "If you don't belong in this line, just say so." Naomi met his eyes without anger. "Interesting," she replied softly. "You seem very certain about where I belong." The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Around them, conversations faded. Boarding slowed. Even the automated announcement seemed to disappear beneath the growing silence. Somewhere farther down the concourse, polished dress shoes echoed steadily across the terminal floor, unnoticed by almost everyone. The people gathered at Gate B22 believed the story had already begun. None of them realized they had just stepped into a test whose results would change far more than a single morning flight. Naomi Brooks did not move an inch. She simply held her boarding pass with both hands, as though the piece of paper deserved more respect than the assumption surrounding it. The gate supervisor folded his arms and exchanged a knowing glance with the security officer. To them, the situation already seemed settled. To Naomi, it had only begun. She looked around the boarding area with quiet curiosity instead of frustration. Families adjusted backpacks. Business travelers refreshed emails. A little boy pointed toward the large jet outside the window, fascinated by the aircraft waiting beneath the pale Georgia sunrise. Life continued for everyone else, but inside Gate B22, time seemed to slow. "May I ask exactly what the issue is?" Naomi said. Her voice carried no anger, only patience. The supervisor answered before the officer could speak. You were directed away from the boarding lane, yet you remained here. That creates a security concern. Naomi glanced down at the boarding pass again. My boarding pass was accepted. That does not mean you belong in the first-class cabin, the supervisor replied with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. A quiet murmur spread through the nearby passengers. Some nodded as though authority alone was enough to settle the matter. Others watched more carefully, sensing something that did not fit. Emily Carter stood several yards away, pretending to organize boarding documents while replaying the passenger manifest in her mind. Naomi Brooks. The name had stood out earlier that morning because an unusual notation appeared beside it. She could not remember the exact wording, only that it had required executive handling instead of normal boarding procedures. She looked toward the computer terminal behind the gate desk, wondering if she should verify what she remembered. Before she could step forward, the supervisor noticed her hesitation. Emily, continue boarding Group 1, he said firmly without taking his eyes off Naomi. I will handle this. Emily nodded automatically, but her feet did not move. Something about Naomi's composure made every accusation sound weaker instead of stronger. Most passengers protested when questioned. Some became defensive. Others demanded managers immediately. Naomi did none of those things. She simply observed. Every sentence. Every expression. Every choice. It almost felt as though she expected people to reveal themselves. The security officer extended an open hand. Identification, please. Naomi handed over her driver's license without hesitation. He examined it for barely 2 seconds before passing it to the supervisor. Looks legitimate, the officer admitted quietly. That is not the point, the supervisor answered. He compared the identification to the boarding pass, then looked back at Naomi's plain clothes. His expression never softened. Where did you obtain this ticket? Naomi blinked once. From the airline. A few passengers smiled at the simple answer. The supervisor did not. First-class tickets are expensive. Naomi's eyes remained steady. Yes, they usually are. An uncomfortable silence followed. Even the officer seemed unsure where the conversation was heading. Emily finally glanced toward the passenger manifest again. Her heartbeat quickened. The notation beside Naomi's name suddenly came back to her with startling clarity, and as realization settled over her, she slowly lifted her eyes toward the entrance of the concourse, where several figures in dark business suits had just appeared in the distance, walking calmly toward gate B22. Emily Carter could no longer ignore the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. She quietly stepped toward the gate computer while the supervisor remained focused on Naomi Brooks. Every instinct told her to verify the passenger record before another word was spoken. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before she could enter the reservation number, the supervisor turned sharply. Emily, I already told you to continue boarding. His voice was calm enough for passengers to hear, yet firm enough to stop her. She hesitated for only a second before stepping back, though her eyes never left the monitor. Naomi noticed the exchange without saying a word. She had spent years sitting through negotiations where silence revealed more than arguments ever could. Sometimes the person trying hardest to control the room unintentionally exposed the most about themselves. This morning felt strangely familiar. The security officer shifted his weight and glanced toward the growing line of waiting passengers. If there has been some mistake with your reservation, customer service can help you after this flight departs. Naomi smiled politely. You have already decided it is my reservation that is mistaken. The officer did not answer. He simply looked toward the supervisor, waiting for instructions. That single glance spoke volumes. Authority was not following evidence. Evidence was following authority. Nearby, a tall man wearing an expensive navy blazer shook his head quietly. She has not caused any trouble, he muttered to his wife. She nodded but lowered her voice. People usually do not stay this calm unless they know something everyone else does not. Across the boarding lane, another first-class passenger approached with a leather travel bag and an oversized coffee cup. The boarding pass was scanned without hesitation. "Welcome aboard, sir." No additional questions followed. Naomi watched the interaction carefully before looking back at the supervisor. "Interesting," she said softly. "Different process." The supervisor forced a thin smile. "Every situation is different." "I agree," Naomi replied. "Character often reveals exactly how different." The word settled over the boarding area like a slow-moving cloud. No one interrupted. Even the rolling suitcases seemed quieter. Emily glanced once more toward the passenger manifest. She could barely make out the highlighted notation from where she stood, but one phrase was unmistakable now. Executive observation. Her heartbeat quickened. She had completed special training only 6 months earlier, and that designation had been mentioned exactly once. Certain travelers were occasionally invited by corporate leadership to evaluate the customer experience without advance notice to airport staff. Those evaluations were confidential. Employees were never supposed to know who the observer was unless instructed by senior leadership. Emily felt a chill run through her shoulders. She looked back at Naomi, whose calm expression suddenly made perfect sense. Before Emily could speak, the supervisor reached across the counter and quietly picked up Naomi's boarding pass again. "Until we finish verifying everything," he said, placing it beside the computer terminal instead of returning it, "I will need to hold this." Naomi looked at the boarding pass resting beneath his hand but made no attempt to retrieve it. "Of course," she answered evenly. "Every decision has a record." The supervisor dismissed the remark with a shrug. What he failed to notice was the reflection in the large terminal windows behind Naomi. Several executives in tailored business suits had entered the concourse and were now walking steadily toward gate B22, led by a distinguished man whose face caused Emily's eyes to widen the instant she recognized him. Emily Carter could feel the weight of every passing second. Training had taught her to trust procedures, but experience had taught her something even more valuable. When facts and assumptions moved in opposite directions, facts deserved another look. She took one careful step toward the supervisor. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I think we should verify the executive notation on Ms. Brooks' reservation before we continue." The supervisor barely looked at her. "There is nothing to verify." Emily swallowed. "I believe there is." He finally turned, irritation replacing confidence. "Emily, your responsibility is boarding passengers, not questioning management." She glanced toward Naomi, who remained as composed as she had been from the beginning. There was no frustration on her face, only patient observation. It was as though she had expected every word to unfold exactly this way. Emily lowered her voice. "I remember seeing a special designation beside her name this morning." The supervisor gave a dismissive laugh. "You are new. You probably misunderstood what you saw." Several passengers exchanged curious looks. The businessman who had been quietly watching closed his laptop completely. A mother traveling with her teenage daughter whispered, "Why not just check the system?" No one answered her. Naomi finally spoke. "Verification usually resolves uncertainty." The supervisor folded his arms tighter. "We have already verified enough." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Have you verified my reservation, or have you verified your opinion?" The question lingered in the silence. Even the security officer shifted uncomfortably. He had begun the encounter believing he was assisting with routine boarding. Now he was no longer certain where routine ended and assumption began. Emily gathered her courage. "Sir, company policy encourages us to confirm executive notes before denying boarding." The supervisor's expression hardened. "And company policy also expects employees to respect the chain of command." Emily looked toward the computer screen one more time. She knew exactly where the notation appeared. One click would answer every question in less than 5 seconds. Yet she also understood that touching the terminal without permission would create another conflict. Naomi noticed the hesitation. "Doing the right thing is rarely convenient," she said softly. Emily met her eyes for the first time. There was no accusation in them, only calm encouragement. Something inside Emily settled. She realized this woman was not trying to win an argument. She was allowing everyone else to reveal who they chose to become when presented with a simple decision. Around the gate, more passengers had stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations faded into whispers. The boarding line had barely moved in several minutes. One elderly gentleman quietly remarked, "Respect should never depend on what someone is wearing." His wife nodded without taking her eyes off Naomi. The supervisor sighed dramatically before picking up the boarding pass once again. "Until this matter is resolved, you will remain here." Naomi answered with the same steady tone. "I have nowhere else I need to be at the moment." Her words sounded ordinary, yet Emily sensed another meaning beneath them. Naomi was waiting, not because she lacked options, but because time itself seemed to be part of whatever was unfolding. At that very moment, the group of executives reached the entrance to gate B22. The distinguished man leading them slowed his pace as his eyes settled on Naomi Brooks. His expression changed instantly from casual professionalism to unmistakable recognition, and without saying a single word to anyone beside him, he changed direction and began walking straight toward her. Naomi Brooks watched the approaching executives only through the faint reflection in the terminal windows. She did not turn around. She did not wave. She did not acknowledge that she had noticed them at all. Instead, her attention remained fixed on the supervisor who still rested one hand over her boarding pass as though possession of a piece of paper meant possession of the truth. The security officer said more quietly than before, "Perhaps it would be easier if you waited in the customer service area until we sort this out." Naomi answered with the same calm that had unsettled everyone since the first moment. "If there is truly something to sort out, I am happy to wait right here where it began." The words carried no challenge. They carried certainty. The supervisor shook his head impatiently. "You are delaying our boarding process." Naomi glanced toward the passengers still standing in line. "I have not stopped anyone from boarding." No one disagreed. In fact, several travelers had chosen to remain where they were simply to see how the situation would unfold. Emily Carter noticed that even the flight crew waiting at the aircraft door had begun looking back toward the gate. Every eye seemed drawn toward the quiet woman who had never once raised her voice. For a brief moment, Naomi's thoughts drifted far from Atlanta. 20 years earlier she had stood in another airport wearing a Navy business suit she had saved for months to afford. She had been 22 years old, traveling to her first national leadership conference after earning a scholarship that changed the direction of her career. She remembered the excitement she had felt while holding her boarding pass. She also remembered the employee who glanced at her ticket, looked back at her face, and asked whether she was certain she belonged in the priority boarding line. She remembered stepping aside because she believed cooperation would solve everything. It did not. She missed her flight that morning while others with identical tickets boarded without delay. No apology ever came. What remained was not anger. It was clarity. From that day forward, she promised herself she would never measure people by titles, clothing, or assumptions if she ever held a position of influence. That promise quietly shaped every leadership decision she would later make. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived. Naomi returned her attention to the present, where the supervisor finally reached across the counter and slid her driver's license aside without returning her boarding pass. "We are still reviewing this," he said. Emily could no longer remain silent. "Sir, there is nothing left to review unless we refuse to look at the information already in the system." Her voice was steady despite the nervousness she felt. The supervisor stared at her in disbelief. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Emily answered honestly. "I am asking us to verify the facts." A hush settled over the gate. The businessman who had been watching since the beginning nodded almost imperceptibly. The elderly couple exchanged quiet smiles of encouragement toward Emily. Naomi looked at the young flight attendant with genuine respect. "Integrity usually speaks softly," she said. "That is why so many people fail to hear it." Emily felt her heartbeat steady. For the first time that morning, she was no longer afraid of being the only person willing to ask one more question. Behind the growing circle of passengers, the distinguished executive had nearly reached the boarding lane. The employees at the gate still had not noticed him. But the expression on his face made one thing unmistakably clear. He knew exactly who Naomi Brooks was, and with every step he took, the quiet test that had begun minutes earlier was about to reach the point where no assumption could hide behind authority any longer. The distinguished executive stepped through the growing crowd without rushing, yet every stride seemed to quiet another voice inside gate B22. The conversation stopped one by one. Even the rolling suitcases seemed to fade beneath the polished rhythm of dress shoes crossing the terminal floor. Emily Carter recognized him immediately. Daniel Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Horizon National Airways. She had seen him only in company training videos and annual leadership meetings streamed across the network. He was never scheduled to be in Atlanta that morning. Neither the supervisor nor the security officer noticed him at first. Their attention remained fixed on Naomi Brooks, convinced they were still in control of the situation unfolding before them. Daniel slowed to a stop only a few feet behind Naomi. The executives accompanying him remained several steps back, saying nothing. It was obvious they understood that whatever happened next belonged to him alone. Daniel looked at Naomi for a brief moment, his expression calm but unmistakably respectful. Then he smiled warmly. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," he said. "I hope we have not kept you waiting too long." The words landed like a sudden change in air pressure. The supervisor blinked twice before turning around. The security officer straightened instinctively. Emily felt every uneasy suspicion she had carried for the past several minutes become certainty. Naomi finally turned to face Daniel. She returned the smile with the relaxed confidence of someone greeting a professional colleague rather than the leader of one of the largest airlines in the country. "Good morning, Daniel," she replied. "I have been learning quite a bit." No one spoke. The supervisor looked from Naomi to Daniel and back again, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. He forced an uncertain smile. "Sir, we were simply verifying this passenger's boarding credentials." Daniel's eyes shifted toward the boarding pass still resting beneath the supervisor's hand. "Were you?" he asked quietly. "Because it appears her credentials were accepted several minutes ago." The supervisor hesitated. There were additional concerns. Daniel nodded once. "Please explain those concerns." The question was simple, but the silence that followed was not. The supervisor glanced toward the security officer, hoping someone else would answer first. No one did. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks. The businessman who had quietly observed everything closed his laptop and folded his hands. The elderly couple remained perfectly still. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, grateful she had chosen to speak when she did. Daniel extended his hand toward the counter. "May I see Ms. Brooks' boarding pass?" The supervisor quickly picked it up and handed it over. Daniel examined it for less than 2 seconds before returning it directly to Naomi. "Everything appears exactly as expected." Naomi accepted the boarding pass without triumph or satisfaction. She simply slipped it into her jacket pocket. Daniel then turned toward Emily. "Were you the employee who requested that the reservation be verified through the executive system?" Emily nodded carefully. "Yes, sir." "Thank you," Daniel said. "You followed procedure." Her shoulders relaxed for the first time that morning. The supervisor's confidence visibly faded. "Sir, we believed we were protecting the integrity of the first-class boarding process." Daniel looked around at the passengers who had witnessed every moment. "The integrity of this airline has never depended on who stands in the first-class line," he said evenly. "It has always depended on how we treat the people standing in it." Naomi met his eyes once more. Neither of them needed to explain anything further. The real purpose of the morning had never been about boarding an airplane. It had been about revealing what happened when ordinary authority believed no one important was watching, and everyone at Gate B22 was beginning to understand that the most important part of the evaluation had only just been completed. Daniel Whitmore allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. Years of leading board meetings had taught him that the truth rarely needed to compete with raised voices. He looked first at Naomi Brooks, then slowly across the faces of the supervisor, the security officer, and every employee standing behind the gate counter. "I believe everyone here deserves to understand why Ms. Brooks is traveling with us today," he said. The supervisor straightened slightly, hoping an explanation might somehow undo the previous 20 minutes. Daniel continued in the same calm tone. 3 months ago, our board of directors approved an independent customer experience initiative. We wanted honest answers, not polished reports. That meant inviting respected business leaders to experience our airline exactly as ordinary passengers do. No advance notice. No special treatment. No executive escorts. A ripple moved through the passengers. Several exchanged surprised glances. Emily Carter felt her stomach tighten as every piece finally fit together. Daniel turned toward Naomi with unmistakable respect. "Ms. Brooks accepted our invitation despite an exceptionally busy schedule because she believes service is the clearest reflection of leadership." Naomi smiled politely but remained silent. Daniel continued. "Many of you know me as the Chief Executive Officer of Horizon National Airways. What most people do not know is that Ms. Brooks serves as chairwoman of the Brooks Leadership Foundation, an organization that has helped transform customer service standards across multiple industries. Our board specifically requested her independent evaluation because her recommendations influence companies throughout the country." The supervisor's face lost what little confidence remained. He stared at Naomi as though seeing her for the first time. Daniel noticed. "That is precisely the lesson," he said quietly. "Nothing about Ms. Brooks changed during the past 20 minutes. The only thing that changed was what you believed about her." No one responded. The security officer lowered his eyes. Emily stood motionless, remembering Naomi's steady patience from the very beginning. Daniel looked toward the passengers gathered around the boarding lane. "Every one of you witnessed something important today. Not because someone famous was delayed, but because assumptions were made before facts were checked." Naomi finally spoke, her voice gentle enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "The purpose of this evaluation was never to discover whether your boarding technology worked. It clearly did. My boarding pass scanned correctly the first time. The real question was what would happen after the technology confirmed I belonged here, but human judgment decided otherwise." Her words settled over the terminal with quiet force. She continued, "Great organizations are not measured by how they welcome executives whose names everyone recognizes. They are measured by how they treat travelers who appear completely ordinary." Emily felt those words stay with her instantly. The businessman who had watched since the beginning nodded slowly. The elderly couple smiled with quiet approval. Even passengers who had remained silent throughout the encounter now seemed to understand they had witnessed something much larger than a disagreement at an airport gate. Daniel folded his hands calmly. "Ms. Brooks has not raised her voice once this morning," he said. "She did not need to. Character has a way of speaking for itself." Naomi looked around the boarding area one final time before meeting Daniel's eyes again. "A report can describe policies," she said. "But only people reveal culture. Today, everyone here wrote part of that report themselves." For several long seconds, no one moved. The supervisor stood behind the counter as though the floor itself had become unfamiliar beneath his feet. The certainty that had filled his voice only minutes earlier had disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable realization that every decision he had made was now visible to everyone around him. Daniel Whitmore looked toward the small group of executives who had accompanied him. One of them quietly opened a tablet and began documenting the incident. No dramatic announcement was necessary. Everyone understood that the review had already begun. Daniel returned his attention to the supervisor. "Effective immediately," he said evenly, "you will be relieved from boarding responsibilities pending a formal review by our employee relations and service standards teams. During that review, your access to supervisory duties will be suspended." The supervisor lowered his head slightly. He did not argue. He knew every passenger standing nearby had witnessed exactly how the situation unfolded. Daniel then turned toward the security officer. Your role is to protect travelers while respecting verified information. I expect your full cooperation with the investigation as we review every decision made this morning. The officer nodded quietly. Yes, sir. Daniel's expression remained calm. This review is not about punishment for honest mistakes. It is about understanding why verified facts were ignored after they were available. The distinction mattered, and everyone listening could hear it. Naomi Brooks remained silent, allowing Daniel to lead the conversation. She had never come to the airport hoping someone would lose a position. She had come hoping an organization willing to examine itself honestly could become stronger than it had been yesterday. Daniel turned toward Emily Carter. Emily, thank you for speaking up when it would have been easier to remain silent. Emily looked almost surprised to hear her name. I was only trying to follow policy, she answered. Daniel smiled. You followed something even more important. You followed integrity when it became uncomfortable. Naomi nodded in agreement. Organizations improve because someone chooses truth over convenience. Emily felt those words settle deeply. She realized the lesson she would remember from that morning had very little to do with airports and everything to do with leadership. Around the boarding area, several passengers quietly applauded. It was not loud or theatrical. It was the natural response of people who had watched fairness return after uncertainty. The businessman who had observed from the beginning closed his laptop and said softly, "That is how accountability should look." The elderly woman beside him smiled. Respect does not need to be loud to be powerful. Daniel glanced toward the departure screen. The flight would still leave on schedule. He addressed the waiting passengers. Thank you for your patience this morning. Every customer deserves to feel welcome from the moment they enter one of our gates. We fell short of that standard today, and we will learn from it. Naomi looked across the faces gathered around her. Some appeared thoughtful. Others seemed quietly humbled. No one looked away anymore. The same people who had once watched her with uncertainty were now listening with genuine attention. Without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, and without reminding anyone of her accomplishments, she had allowed character to become the strongest evidence in the room. As boarding preparations quietly resumed under new supervision, the atmosphere at Gate B22 felt completely different. Nothing about the terminal had changed. The same windows overlooked the runway. The same aircraft waited outside. The same travelers held the same tickets. Yet everyone understood that they were no longer standing in the same place they had been only a few minutes earlier, because once assumptions had been replaced by truth, even an ordinary airport gate could become a classroom where dignity was finally given the seat it had deserved all along. Naomi Brooks accepted her boarding pass one final time and slipped it into her jacket pocket with the same quiet composure she had carried from the very beginning. Nothing about her posture suggested victory. She had not come to the airport to prove she belonged in first class. She had come to discover whether dignity belonged there too. Daniel Whitmore walked beside her toward the boarding lane, but before they reached the aircraft door, he paused and turned back toward the employees and passengers gathered near the gate. Today was never about finding perfect people, he said. It was about building an airline willing to learn when it falls short of its own values. Every interaction is a chance to strengthen trust or weaken it. This morning reminded us that policies only matter when people choose to honor them. The boarding area remained silent. Emily Carter stood near the gate scanner, absorbing every word. She realized that leadership was not measured by rank, title, or years of experience. It was measured by the willingness to protect fairness even when standing alone. Daniel smiled toward her. Emily, beginning next month, I would like you to join our Service Excellence Advisory Council. We need employees who are willing to ask one more question before making one more assumption. Emily's eyes widened with surprise. Thank you, sir, she replied softly. I will do my best. Naomi looked at her warmly. Do not do your best because someone important is watching. Do your best because someone who feels invisible might be. Emily nodded, knowing she would remember that sentence for the rest of her career. As passengers resumed boarding, several stopped to speak with Naomi. The businessman who had quietly observed from the beginning shook her hand. "Thank you for staying calm," he said. "You taught all of us something this morning." The elderly couple smiled as they passed. "Safe travels," the woman said. "And thank you for reminding us what grace looks like." Naomi thanked each of them with the same kindness she had shown everyone else. There was no celebration, no dramatic farewell, only ordinary conversations made meaningful by honesty. Once inside the aircraft, Naomi settled into her seat beside the window. The runway stretched across the morning light as baggage carts moved steadily below. Daniel stopped beside her for a final moment before returning to the front of the cabin. "I appreciate your willingness to help us improve," he said. Naomi looked out the window before answering. Organizations rarely fail because they lack policies. They fail when assumptions become stronger than principles. The encouraging part is that culture can change the moment people decide to see one another clearly. Daniel nodded thoughtfully before continuing toward the cockpit. A few minutes later, the aircraft pushed back from the gate exactly on schedule. Through the window, gate B-22 slowly disappeared behind the terminal as another ordinary morning continued for thousands of travelers moving through the airport. Yet for everyone who had witnessed those quiet moments, the day would be remembered differently. They had watched respect tested before titles were revealed. They had seen integrity arrive long before authority did. They had learned that appearances could invite assumptions, but character always outlasted them. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment as the aircraft turned toward the runway. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded special treatment. She had simply allowed truth enough time to catch up with judgment. And in the end, the most powerful lesson was not that an important woman had been recognized. It was that every ordinary traveler deserved the same dignity long before anyone discovered who they were.